Assalamu alaikum. This is Dr. Lubna from Anatomy Department, Amiruddin Medical College, PGMI. And today we're going to learn about the peritoneal disposition in the abdominal cavity. When we start to learn or to understand the disposition of the peritoneum and its two layers, the parietal layer as well as the visceral layer. The first thing that we study is the inside of the abdominal walls, the anterior abdominal wall as well as the posterior abdominal wall, the thoraco-abdominal diaphragm, that is its undersurface, as well as the pelvic surface, which makes up the floor of the pelvis. We study all these surfaces first, and then we try to understand how the peritoneum is positioned within this cavity, which is a large cavity, of course. And the other thing that we need to understand is the development of the peritoneum, how it is developed and how the GIT is developed, and how during the development of the gastrointestinal tract, how it takes complicated twists and turns and then is repositioned back, and also how the small intestines, they move out of the abdominal cavity. That is the physiological herniation, which occurs at around 6 weeks of development, and then it returns back to the abdominal cavity at about 10th week of the development. And then the intestines, they are repositioned. Because of these complicated twists, these turns of the GIT, and then repositioning of the GIT within the abdominal cavity, the peritoneum and its fold, they get attached on the posterior abdominal wall in such a way that we cannot understand until and unless we try to understand the development of the GIT. So it is very important that we understand how this all happens. So the first thing that I want to explain here is the posterior abdominal wall. And you can see that the posterior abdominal wall here is has been shown in this trunk. How we understand the development and the disposition of the peritoneum within this cavity, we try to give certain examples, or we try to set up certain models through which we try to understand how this happens. The commonest form of understanding how the peritoneal cavity develops and how the gut is incorporated within the abdominal cavity along with the peritoneal attachments and disposition, we consider the peritoneal cavity, or let's say the primitive peritoneal cavity, as a semi-inflated balloon model. Okay, so I'm going to show you how that occurs. So let's see. Okay, here we can see the posterior abdominal wall and showing the structures that make up the posterior abdominal wall. This is an inflated balloon which represents the primitive peritoneal cavity, and through this we'll try to learn how the peritoneal cavity develops within the abdominal cavity. So let's consider this is the primitive peritoneal cavity, right? Okay, and this is the posterior abdominal wall that we can see. This is the primitive gut that is developing within the abdominal cavity. Now, during its development, the primitive gut, during its development, it develops. Now, as you can see, I'll just turn it around so you can see how the developing gut is placed behind the developing peritoneal cavity. Okay, this is a semi-inflated balloon, and this is the developing gut which presses against this cavity from behind like this. And now I just want you to understand that the part of the balloon that covers this tube, this makes up the visceral peritoneum, while the part of the balloon which is away from the gut, or let's say which is not the visceral peritoneum, this is going to develop into the parietal peritoneum. Now let's just play it and see. This is how it presses against the peritoneal cavity, and that's what happens. Okay. Alright, now this is a model which shows that during this pressing, during this invagination of the gut within that balloon, this is what we see in the end. I mean, you can see that the gut tube that kept on invaginating into that cavity, and then it went to lie down, it went to it resulted in the formation of this fold which is suspending the gut which is suspending this fold of gut through this membrane and attaches it to the posterior abdominal wall. Okay, now let's play it again. So this is the visceral peritoneum which is covering the gut, and the part that covers the abdominal walls that makes up the parietal peritoneum. Now after this, in which I have tried to explain how the gut develops into the peritoneal cavity and resulted in the formation of the part of peritoneum which covered the surface of the gut, which enveloped the gut and resulted in the formation of the visceral peritoneum, while that part of the gut which lined the walls of the abdominal cavity resulted in the development and formation of the parietal peritoneum. Okay, now I just want to show you the placement of the abdominal organs within the abdominal cavity, how they are placed, so you can see what is the position of these organs within the abdominal cavity. Okay, now that is the large intestine, the colon, and this is the ascending colon, this is the descending colon. This thing, light colored, is mesentery. This is duodenum, head of pancreas, body and tail of pancreas. This is pancreatic duct. These are splenic vessels. Okay, now that is the posterior abdominal wall. And in the posterior abdominal wall, we can see abdominal aorta and its division into the right and left common iliac vessels. Then this is the inferior vena cava and its division into right and left common iliac veins. This is right and left kidney, suprarenal glands, thoracoabdominal diaphragm. These are the muscles of the posterior abdominal wall. This is urinary bladder. Okay, and now we'll try to place the different abdominal organs within the abdominal cavity. This part that I'm holding is the transverse colon and the transverse mesocolon. The light colored is transverse mesocolon. Okay, the fold of peritoneum which suspends it with the posterior abdominal wall. This is how they are placed within the abdominal cavity. Okay. Now we'll try to see what is the position of the liver and the stomach within this part. This is how they are placed in the right and left upper quadrants. Okay, now I've placed the large and the small intestines within the abdominal cavity, and next I'm going to place the stomach as well as the liver in the right and left upper quadrants. This is the visceral surface of the liver, and the front is the diaphragmatic or the anterior surface of the liver. This is how they are placed, and this is how we position all the abdominal organs within the abdominal cavity. Okay, now this is the anterior abdominal wall, its anterior aspect. Okay, we can see the on the left side we can see the fibers of the external oblique descending downwards, the pink fibers that we see, and then the light blue structure that is shown in the midline, or let's say medial to the muscles appearance. We see this light blue colored, this is aponeurosis, right? Muscular aponeurosis that we see, and it makes up the rectus sheath in the midline. On the right side we can see this the rectus abdominis muscle with the tendinous intersections in between. This is covered by the anterior layer of the rectus sheath, because we know that the rectus sheath has an anterior layer and a posterior layer. Then on the right side we can see the transverse fibers of the transversus abdominis muscle. Now if we turn it over, we can see the internal surface of the anterior abdominal wall. We can see the transversus abdominis fibers laterally, and on medial to the fibers we can see the aponeurosis, the aponeurotic layer, which which also makes up the posterior layer of the rectus sheath. Here we can see that in the lower 1/3 the posterior layer of the rectus sheath is deficient, and here we can see the muscle, the rectus abdominis muscle, the inferior epigastric vessels here, and we can also see this green line. We can see this green line, which is the arcuate line. This is where the posterior layer of the rectus sheath ends. Okay. So this is the anterior abdominal wall. Okay, now I'm going to show you how the different layers of the peritoneum, they make up the different folds which are reflected from the anterior abdominal wall onto the different viscera that comes in its way. So this is the internal aspect of the anterior abdominal wall, and we can see that the layers of peritoneum are reflected from the right as well as from the left side, and they are reflected backwards. Okay, this from this side, this is the left side of the trunk, it is reflected to make this layer. Okay, and from the right side the other layer is reflected, the parietal peritoneum is reflected from this wall to make up the other layer. These two layers, they are reflected and they move on posteriorly towards the liver, and they make up the falciform ligament. This is the falciform ligament, the lower free border. This upper border of the falciform ligament, this is reflected onto the under surface of the diaphragm. Okay. Now I've placed liver here so we can see how the falciform ligament is developed. The falciform ligament, it has in its lower border the paraumbilical veins, the ligamentum teres as its content, and here we can see that the folds of peritoneum, the two layers, they are reflected onto the stomach. This is the free border of this fold. This is the lesser omentum, and here I am pointing where the epiploic foramen is present. Okay. Here the anterior and the posterior layers coming from the stomach, they make up this fold. Okay, which is reflected onto itself to make up 4 layers. They fuse together to make a single layer. This is greater omentum. This is the formation of the greater omentum. So Here we saw this is the falciform ligament in between the anterior abdominal wall and the liver, and then we had this inverted L-shaped attachment of lesser omentum on the liver, which is this layer, two-layered. This is lesser omentum, and lesser omentum, as you know, it has two parts, the hepatogastric ligament as well as the hepatoduodenal ligaments. They have their contents also. This is the greater omentum, which is actually four-layered fold which fuses together to make up one layer. This layer, the greater omentum, the two layers, layer 1 and layer 2, folds on itself to be attached posteriorly to the transverse mesocolon or the anterior surface of the head of pancreas as well as the anterior border of body of pancreas to make up the greater omentum. Now here we see the formation of these folds from another aspect. One layer comes from anterior abdominal wall reflected onto the liver and comes from the back to make up this posterior layer. The other layer is reflected from the inverted L-shaped and is reflected to make up the two layers of lesser omentum. We're trying to make the lesser omentum, okay, two-layered. This is two-layered. Lesser omentum. Now we place stomach here. The lesser omentum is formed after enveloping the stomach anteriorly and posteriorly. The two layers, they hang in front of the coils of intestines and they make up the greater omentum. Now how this greater omentum is made up of four layers, we'll just see in a while. And you remember that the blood vessels, the greater and the lesser epiploic foramen as well as the right and left gastric vessels, the blood vessels are placed in between layer 1 and layer 2. Okay, you remembered this. This is a common viva question. Now these two layers of greater omentum, they are reflected onto themselves. Let me just cut it and show it to you how this is reflected on itself to make up four layers of greater omentum which fuse together to make one layer greater omentum. Only about 1 inch of cavity in between these four layers is left. That is the cavity between layer 2 and layer 3. Only 1 inch below the stomach is left. Rest of it all fuses. Okay. Okay, let me just reposition this. This is how it envelops the stomach and then suspends in front of the coils of intestines, these two layers, and then they fold on themselves. Two layers, they fold on themselves to make up four layers. Okay? I just kept on repeating this again and again so you clearly understand how this is formed. The four layers, the layer 1 becomes layer 4, layer 2 becomes layer 3, and in between layer 2 and 3 there's some space which is obliterated in the adult life and only 1 inch is left below the stomach. The blood vessels, they lie in between layer 1 and layer 2. Okay, this is how this is formed. Now let's understand how the mesentery of the small intestine is formed and how this root of mesentery attaches to the posterior abdominal wall. This is also a common viva question, that what is the root of mesentery, and we described that this is an inclined line of attachment of the peritoneal fold to the posterior abdominal wall. On the left side at the duodenojejunal junction at the level of L2, and this inclines downwards towards the right to be attached to the posterior abdominal wall right in front of the right sacroiliac joint. Okay, so we have to learn. And there's another very important question, that what are the important structures that the root of mesentery crosses while it attaches to the posterior abdominal wall. And we've got to enumerate those structures also. They include the psoas major muscle, they include the aorta, the inferior vena cava, the right ureter. You have to just learn all those structures to answer that question. Now here you can see how the two layers of mesentery, it's a double layered fold of peritoneum, the mesentery, which suspends the small intestine to the posterior abdominal wall. All the coils of the jejunum as well as ileum, they're just suspended by this mesentery to the posterior abdominal wall, so they can move, they can glide onto each other easily. And let me just cut it to show it to you. Okay, this is the double layered mesentery, the part of peritoneum that envelops the small intestine, the jejunum and the ileal coils, like this, to the posterior abdominal wall. So this tape shows the root of mesentery, and this is how the small intestine hangs through the mesentery to the posterior abdominal wall, and it can easily move here and there because of this mesentery. Mesentery also lets the neurovascular structures to pass from the posterior abdominal wall to different organs. Okay, now in the end, I'll just try to explain how the recesses are formed. We know very well how the important peritoneal spaces are formed. We know that because of the attachment of the peritoneum to the liver, we see the formation of right and left anterior diaphragmatic or subphrenic spaces, and we also see that two important posterior subphrenic spaces are also formed. I have already explained this in my lecture, that there is the formation on the right side. Here from this diagram we can see that on the right side there is formation, because of the reflection of the peritoneum, there is formation of the left anterior subphrenic space, okay, and then there is right anterior subphrenic space, then there is left posterior subhepatic space, and then there is formation of I've told you about the left one, and then there is the right subhepatic right posterior subhepatic space. Okay, so there are four spaces that are formed. We have already studied the lesser sac, the formation of the lesser sac behind the stomach, the lesser omentum, and part of the liver. Okay, so this lesser sac or the omental bursa is actually the left posterior subhepatic space. Okay, so remember this, that this is that space, and then posterior, the other one on the right side, the right posterior subhepatic space is very important clinically, and it is the hepatorenal pouch or the hepatorenal space. It is also called the Morrison's space, and clinically it is very important because it is commonly invaded by occupied or invaded by the presence of pus in cases of infection, because it is the most dependent space or the most dependent region of the abdominal cavity when the person is lying straight. Okay, now I'm going to explain how the anterior subphrenic spaces are formed. Okay, I've already told you about the lesser sac as well as the Morrison's pouch, which are lying posteriorly, and we call that they are the subhepatic spaces. The two anterior right and left anterior spaces, we call them, they are the subphrenic spaces, or they lie below the diaphragm. The two posterior spaces, they lie below the liver. Okay, now this paper shows how the peritoneum is reflected from the anterior abdominal wall onto the surface of the liver. On the left side, you can see that the peritoneum is reflected like this and makes this space. So this space that is formed is making up the right anterior space. Okay, one layer is attached here, which is making up one layer of the falciform ligament. This is the other layer of falciform ligament. Both of them are reflected from the anterior abdominal wall onto the anterior surface of the liver, making up these two anterior spaces, right and left anterior subphrenic spaces. Okay, and from here, this is the attachment of the peritoneum at the inverted L shaped. One layer comes from the right side and the other layer is reflected from this inverted L shaped attachment with the visceral surface of the liver and makes up the lesser omentum. Okay, I hope you understand the disposition of peritoneum. If there's a question, you're most welcome to ask me. Thank you so much.